All right, let's talk about inventory and monitoring. All right, let's start off with definitions of inventory. From your textbook, you might know that inventory is described as a determination of the distribution and composition of wildlife and wildlife habitats in areas where such information is lacking. Of course, that could apply to fish and streams as well. Further on, they point out another uh, definition, and they use a quantitative or qualitative description of a resource or set of resources for a given point or interval of time. And generally, inventories are going to be just snapshots where you go in, you do an inventory of an area at a particular time to maybe compare to that area either from previous studies or for comparisons later on. In an inventory, you typically assess the presence of a species or infer the absence of a species within an area. And I've underlined infer the absence because if you don't detect a species in a survey, it doesn't mean that it's not there. It could be that you just didn't detect it for one reason or another. It may be there seasonally. You may have to use broadcast surveys and so on. A approach that can allow us to estimate our probability of detecting a species is called occupancy analysis. And that is a part of FW 563, which is offered in the online curriculum. So if you're interested in that, you can get into the details of that, the nuts and bolts. Um, it's often, inventories are often required before management actions are taken for a lot of projects by federal and state agencies. They require that surveys for threatened and endangered species are done and maybe some other species of conservation concern. And for many of these species, there are very strict protocols developed for determining whether those species are present. So for instance, for northern spotted owl, you have to visit the site for 2 years and you have to um, have 6 visits per year. And I think there's even some restriction on when those visits can occur. So some very strict protocols. And this is true for many T&E species. So in that sense, it often makes those sorts of surveys somewhat boring, or there's not much creativity there because you have to follow certain protocols. So moving on to monitoring, again, the definition out of your textbook is measure the rates of change or the effects of management practices on wildlife and habitats. So here, notice that now we're looking at change over time. We're not simply looking at a snapshot in time. And the idea is to get an idea of trend in abundance, occupancy, reproductive success, whatever it might be, so that you can get a sense of whether this population is going up or down and whether it's responding to some habitat or other treatment that's being implemented. And monitoring is often mandated by some of our laws, such as the National Forest Management Act, National Environmental Policy Act, and the Endangered Species Act. There are two basic philosophical approaches to monitoring. One is what's referred to as the early warning or the declining species framework. And the second is the early control or knowledge gaining framework from Voss 2000. The declining species framework is by far the most common type of um, monitoring. And it was described in Cawley's 1994 paper on declining species. And if you haven't read that paper, it's really worth taking a look at. It's several decades old now, but I still think it's very, very relevant these days. And basically, the idea was to monitor populations, to look at ones that were getting small and do things to try to keep them from blinking out. And it's a three-step process. So step one is the monitoring the abundance of a species or a group of species until a decline is detected. Secondly, identify the environmental cause. And then third, do whatever you can to ameliorate the cause. And probably one of the best examples of this are raptors and DDT here in the United States. So back in the 50s and 60s, there really wasn't any well-developed monitoring program in place, but there was enough people that were interested in peregrine falcons and bald eagles and ospreys that they kept track of the number of nesting pairs along the rivers in their region and so on. And all over the United States, there was noticeable declines in the numbers of nesting pairs. So that led to some alarm that there was a widespread decline occurring in these species. That then led to identification of the cause, which Rachel Carson's Silent Spring is really the first public description of DDT and its effects on wildlife populations, which really then led to the third step, which was amelioration of the cause, and that is by banning DDT in the United States. Of course, it's not banned in many other countries, so it's still causing problems for many species around the world, unfortunately. So there's some real potential problems with this declining population paradigm. The first is that by definition, the analyses are retrospective. So you go out and collect data on a species or a group of species for many, many years, and then after a number of years, you start plotting it and looking for changes over time. But that can often mean that you're way down the road before you really have detected that there's a problem. And as some people have pointed out, you could just spend a whole career only going out there and counting and not really doing any active conservation efforts. And of course, there's the argument that the counting itself is weak inferential descriptive science, and all you can look for with that kind of approach is correlation, and we know that we can often get misled when we look at correlations. The other problems that have been pointed out is that the research into the cause of the decline is only initiated after the problem is detected, and sometimes we can be way down the road. A good example of this is the California condors. We literally watched their wild populations decline for decades, from the 30s, 40s, 50s until the 80s. They were simply counting the number of condors every year. They were worried because there are so few that if they did any kind of trapping or manipulation, that it could have a negative effect on the population. So they just sit and watched. And they finally went and caught some birds, detected very high levels of lead in their blood. And that's the thing that led to catching virtually all of the California condors in the wild, bringing them into captivity, cleaning them up of their lead poisoning, doing captive breeding, and now, of course, we're putting them back out into the wild only to have many of them die of lead poisoning once they get out there. So we nearly lost them while we were simply sitting there watching and counting them. The other things that this does is it in many cases encourages or forces action to mitigate the problems at the same time that research is in progress. So we're seeing a decline, we're getting to the point where their populations are very low, And we've got to get two things done. We've got to figure out what the problem is and at the same time get out there and do whatever we can to try to mitigate the problems and get that population reversed and increasing again. And oftentimes we do the wrong thing because we haven't really figured out what the problem is. And so that just leads to poor overall management. Um, and another thing that causes problems is that in environmental sciences, the variances are often high from year to year if we're estimating abundance, for instance. So it may take many, many years in order to detect a significant decline, even when you have a fairly strongly declining species because of the year-to-year variation. And finally, there's been a tendency to use health measures as a analogy for this kind of declining population paradigm, similar to, you're going into the doctor every year, getting your checkup, checking your cholesterol and your, heart rate and all of those sorts of things. The problem is that health measures often have very low variability. And as we talked about in our studies, those variations are often high. And in health studies, we often have good information on what a particular change in a parameter means in terms of, is that indicated of a heart problem, diabetes, and so on. So we know exactly what to do when we detect a problem. In environmental sciences, that is simply not the case. This has led to some pretty harsh criticisms of monitoring. This first one by Krebs in 1991 states, monitoring is politically attractive but ecologically banal unless it is coupled with experimental work to understand the mechanisms behind system changes. What we just referred to, really. And Nichols gets even more critical. He says, I believe that some monitoring programs have been established as a result of such displacement behavior with the vague hope that future retrospective looks at monitoring results will somehow lead to a reduction in future uncertainty and to an understanding of population dynamics and responses to management. Again, this idea that we just go out and count year after year, whether it's dove counts, duck counts, deer counts, or whatever, and we really don't have any hypotheses developed, any a priori thresholds or anything. We're just sort of going out collecting data and hoping that if something big happens, we'll be there to find it and then maybe figure out what to do. The knowledge gaining framework, which has been pushed by a lot of ecologists more recently, incorporates monitoring directly into a process of testing hypotheses in order to gain knowledge. So the idea is that you first develop some ecological questions that you'd like to answer with your monitoring program. And it may be as simple as simply stratifying your sample so that you can look at the effects of different treatments on your population. So if you're interested in grassland birds and what might be influencing their abundance regionally, instead of just going out and sampling haphazardly or randomly even, you may say, well, let's look carefully at grazing and see how much grazing has an impact on these populations. So we're not just going to put site plots out there and go monitor them without any kind of thought. We're going to put a certain portion in heavily grazed areas, moderately grazed areas, and ungrazed, and then over time we'll get a sense of how those different treatments might affect our population of interest. Another example would be looking at off-highway vehicles and how they're impacting anything from desert tortoises to lizards to Mojave ground squirrels. Again, choosing to select your sites to monitor based on this question or hypothesis that you're interested in testing. Um, and this often, as well, can be incorporated directly into management options or management approaches. So if you have a permit system for identifying OHV areas, that can then give you a heads up that, okay, this area is going to become a site where we're going to allow OHV use. Let's monitor it before so that we can get a good before after measure, as well as monitoring sites away from that OHV use area. Reintroductions is another area where this explicit approach of trying to gain knowledge can be very helpful. So oftentimes we just sort of throw species out there and then hope for the best, come back a few years later and see if they're still around. But if we, again, beforehand start thinking about, well, what might be important variables that will determine the success of reintroductions? Maybe how many animals we release, what kind of habitat they're in, what sort of rainfall patterns or so on occur after reintroductions. So again, there you're thinking ahead of time before you just go out and start either throwing animals out there or monitoring, and you have explicit hypotheses that you want to test. And that'll give us better tools in our toolbox and help us make better management decisions moving forward. And really with this paradigm, the time series that you obtain after going out and monitoring populations year after year is sort of a secondary outcome and not really the primary outcome. And probably a good example of this all kind of rolled together into one program is the system of monitoring duck breeding populations and duck harvest over time by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Canadian Wildlife Service, where again they have explicit hypotheses about what might influence duck numbers. They're monitoring those covariates like number of ponds, water, rainfall, and that sort of thing. And they're also closely monitoring harvest to see how those all fit together to influence duck populations over time. In your textbook, they talk about 4 factors that need to be considered before you start any monitoring study. The first is what? In other words, what resources are going to be monitored? Secondly is where. Exactly where are you going to sample for the species or group of species? And that really means putting a sample frame on the ground so that you know exactly what your study area entails. Third is when, and that can refer to both study duration and the timing of when the surveys are conducted. So if you're studying amphibians, you might want to go out in the early spring as they're moving into ponds where they breed, and that's often a great time to catch them and get good counts. If you're talking about birds, at the start of the breeding season when the males are doing their singing is a great time to study them. And then finally, the fourth is how, or the methods that you're going to use to monitor the species you're interested in. So I want to go through these for a study that I've become fairly familiar with, and that is surveys of the occupancy of the Mexican spotted owl in Arizona and New Mexico that was conducted by biologists at Bird Conservancy of the Rockies when I was there, and it's still ongoing. So let's go through each one of these for this Mexican spotted owl monitoring. So the first question is, what exactly are they going to monitor on this population? And if any of you are familiar with the northern spotted owl, you know that there's been very intensive population monitoring of northern spotted owls in Oregon, Washington, and California for many decades in some areas to precisely monitor the size of the population, reproductive output, survivorship, and so on, so that we can really have a full picture of the population dynamics. Those are very intensive and very expensive studies to maintain. The Forest Service decided they didn't have the resources to do that, and so they decided that what they would do is monitor spotted owl occupancy, or presence absence of spotted owls across suitable habitat in Region 3 of the Forest Service. The other thing that they decided they wanted to know is whether at a site it was a pair of owls or a single owl without a mate. And so that entailed some thought about the monitoring protocol. So if you go to a site and you detect a male at that site, then you shift your monitoring and focus on whether a female is present by playing female calls, because they'll tend to respond to that more, and so on. The other thing that's important about occupancy is that you need to have more than one visit to a site in order to estimate what we call the detection probability. So as we talked about early on, if you go to a site and you don't detect a species, you don't know if that means that they're really not there, or you just weren't there at the right time. They were a canyon over. They really do occur in that general region, but they just weren't in that particular spot when you were out doing your surveys. And so by doing, in this case, 2 surveys to each site, they can then start looking at across the whole region. Well, we monitored 150 sites, for instance. At 70 of those, owls were detected, and at those sites, half the time we only detected the owls on 1 survey. So with that information, you can get what we call a detection probability. Say it's 75% of the time when you go, you detect the presence of the owls. And then use that to adjust your total number of sites where owls were detected to come up with a better unbiased estimate of what we call occupancy, or the best estimate of the total number of sites that were actually occupied, including the sites where you visited and simply didn't detect them. Again, you need to take another course to get into occupancy analysis. The second question was where, and Mexican spotted owls have some interesting habitat associations. Unlike the northern spotted owl, which pretty much, if you define the habitat in an area, the age of the forest, and so on, the species composition, you can determine whether or not that may be suitable habitat for that species. For Mexican spotted owls, they have sort of this dichotomous habitat selection. One is mixed conifer forests, and these mountains in New Mexico and Arizona are known to be suitable habitat for the species, and that's usually up at pretty high elevations. But they also can be found at fairly low elevations. If you have steep canyons that provide the cool thermal environment that they need, and also allows them to move into those cool spots during the day as the sun moves across. And in some cases it may be dominated by oaks and sycamores, tree species that you normally wouldn't associate with the presence of spotted owls, but they're there because the thermal conditions that they need are present in these steeper canyons. So they already had a pretty good description of Mexican spotted owl habitats, and so they used that to define their sampling frame across the mountains of Arizona and New Mexico. So then the next question was when to survey, and we've already talked about seasonality. In this case, you go early when the owls are actively calling and establishing territories, and into the period when they are raising their young. But the main thing that I'll focus on here is um, how long the Forest Service wanted this monitoring program to go on and what criteria they wanted to use to set up um, the monitoring protocol. They decided that they wanted to have a power of 90% to detect a 25% decline in occupancy over 10 years with a type 1 error rate of 0.1. So you'll notice here that right off the bat that our standard type 1 error rate is 0.05. They bumped it up here to 0.1. Um, and as we know, if you increase the type 1 error rate, you'll be able to get a higher power for same sample size. And so they're willing to sacrifice a little with respect to type 1 error, maybe concluding there's a decline when in fact there's not, in order to have that certainty that they're going to detect a decline if in fact it's happening. When they went through that and using some pilot studies that they had done, they estimated that they needed about 200 sites across this region where they go out and survey owls. And they decided to survey in 1 square kilometer blocks. They placed 5 points within that block, 1 right in the center, and then 4 in the 4 basically corners or equidistant to the corners. They went out and did 2 surveys, as I mentioned. They did broadcasts where they're playing the calls of the owls and basically recording whether or not they get a response. And they've been doing this for a number of years now. I've gotten very good estimates of occupancy for about 5 years. Initially, they saw an increase in occupancy, and now occupancy is starting to drop off a little bit, perhaps because there's been a lot of fires, a lot of beetle kill. The forests are really changing down there, and that may be influencing the owl occupancy. Another consideration is how we visit our sampling sites over time to detect trends. And this is often referred to as panel designs, where units are grouped into panels with similar temporal sampling now. So design 1 is the simplest approach. It's the design that's used in most studies. It was used in the Mexican spotted owl study, where basically you identify your sites and you just go back to those same sites every year. One advantage of this approach is you can now start to look at what we call dynamic occupancy, where you can look at what sites that were previously occupied go extinct, in quotes, where the animals are not present, versus other sites that were not occupied and then get occupied. And there's what we call immigration. So you can start to say what's associated with extinction and immigration in these sites. Is it elevation, habitat? What might it be? So that can be a big advantage. Plus, if you're working in a landscape where it's difficult to get access to sites, so you've set your sampling frame, randomly sampled, and there may be private lands, you have to get permission from landowners and so on. Once you get that permission and you establish a relationship, that can be very, very time consuming, and rather than trying to redo that every year, it's nice to be able to stick with the same sites year after year. Design 2 is essentially the opposite, where you never revisit. You might choose, 1,000 sites out there, and each year you randomly choose 50 of them to go visit. So this is going to survey more of the landscape, obviously, because you'll be shifting sites every year, but you lose that ability to look at year-to-year shifts in immigration and emigration from a site, and you have to get permission to get to those sites each year. Design 3 is what we call a rotating panel, where you survey each panel for a specified number of consecutive periods, and then you choose another group of survey locations and you go out and survey those for a number of years. And again, this is giving you that more complete coverage of your study area, but of course you lose the long-term dynamics of what's happening at each one of those sites. The last 3 I'll just go through quickly. They're not used as much. Design 4 is what's called augmented serially alternating. Some sites are visited every period, others only in alternating years. Design 5, same as 4, but some panels receive 2 consecutive periods. And then design 6 would be a totally random revisit. Doesn't matter whether you've revisited it in the past, you just randomly choose a sample each year and go out and visit those sites. One way of visually displaying these panel designs is with a table like shown here, where on the left is the panel number and the size, which refers to sample size, and then across the top there are the time periods, and the X's indicate when the samples within that panel are surveyed. So the top row of X's would refer to design 1, where you're always revisiting the same sites. Design 2 is the never revisit. So each year you would choose 60 new sites to go out and sample. So your X's basically fall along the diagonal. If we look at some of these more complex designs, on the top here we have the rotating panel, where we have 5 different panels. And initially those panels are surveyed from between 1 and 5 years, but as new panels are added, each one of those new ones is then sampled for 5 years in a row. You simply have this this shortened entry at the beginning because you have to move through all of the different panels, and then you get into the consistent 5-year survey of those different panels. So again, it gives you more coverage every area. You're not just restricting your surveys to the same sites every year, so you can get a sense of whether these patterns might be differing across your study area. The augmented serial alternating design, here we have again 5 different panels that we are surveying. 1 through 4 are surveyed once every 5 years, and those would be the same sites in those 5-year intervals, and you can see that those are offset. So in the first year, panel 1 is surveyed, second year, panel 2 is surveyed. Once you get out to year 5, now you're back to panel 1. Year 6, you do panel 2, and so on. And then you have a panel, in this case 10 survey units, that are surveyed every year, so that you can look at this dynamic kind of occupancy. The advantage of this is that, again, you're looking at more different sites by sampling them once every 5 years. If there is some major trend in your population, presumably you'll be able to detect it because there will be big changes between year 1 and year 5. Whereas you may have relatively small changes each year. So yeah, each one of these can have advantages for different kinds of situations. So here has been plotted the power to detect a trend using these different types of sampling designs based on simulation analyses. So doing simulations on the computer, but that can often give us insights into how well these might work in the real world. And on the left-hand graph here, you see power on the y-axis, time and year on the x-axis, and the curves represent the different types of panel designs that we talked about. So you can see that top curve, which has the highest power, it goes up to almost 1 after about 20 years. And I should also add that on this left-hand side, we are assuming no temporal variation. So we have a constant trend, like -5% per year or something. It does allow for site variation, so variation in abundance from one site to another. But the overall trend across all those sites is assumed to be constant and equivalent, so not particularly realistic, but one thing it does is it shows how these different panel designs really separate out. So 1 and 4 and 5, 1 was the constant panel design where you just visit the same sites year after year. 4 and 5 were those augmented sample designs. And those essentially have equivalent power. So from this perspective, it doesn't matter which one you select. You see that the completely random design is the worst. That's number 3 at the bottom there, very low power. And I'm sorry, the no revisit is the worst, and the random is somewhere in between. And again, with the random, you are picking up some of the same sites from year to year, so that probably explains that. Now, if you move over to the right-hand panel, B, well, you see now what we've done is introduced temporal variation. So instead of this nice constant decline over time, which really is not very realistic, now we allow for our populations to bounce up and down as they're declining or increasing, whatever it might be. And here is just displayed the results of the panel 1 design, so constant sites over time, which is generally, again, what most of us are going to be using. And you can see that as the year-to-year variance increases, our power to detect a trend really drops off until you see at those very high levels of year-to-year variation. You know, it's going to take you 100 years to detect a significant trend. So temporal variation is our nemesis. It really can make it difficult to detect trends in populations. I just want to briefly mention dual frame sampling designs because these are being considered and are actually being used now or encouraged to be used for bald eagle sampling across the United States. And with dual frame sampling, they're a subset of multi-frame designs in which units within the population of interest are selected via independent probability samples from each of the 2 frames. So in this dual frame sampling, you start with a list frame, and in this case it might be a list of known bald eagle nest locations. Okay, so bald eagle nests are pretty conspicuous. A lot of people are interested in them. They've seen them at this reservoir year after year, and so they like going out and monitoring them and seeing how they're doing. These are obviously not a random sample from the population. These are often going to be near big city centers, along big rivers that are accessible, and might be nests that have been monitored in some cases for decades. People have gone back and checked out these nesting pairs. So that could maybe be useful for looking at trends over time to see how many of those sites are remaining occupied um, over time. But it really isn't going to give you a measure of the, say, the total number of nests that might be out there or bald eagle pairs. And so in addition to the list frame, you also select an area frame, which is a simple random sample of the entire population. And you could use some criteria like it has to be within, a kilometer of a river in order for, a sample to meet your criteria. But once you've determined what that sample frame is, then you randomly sample from it and you send people out and say, okay, here's 50 other sites across Tennessee that we're going to go visit. We don't know if eagles are there or not, but we're just going to go visit them. They've got the characteristics that may make them suitable habitat, and that will give us a sample that we can then use to say, based on this, we estimate, a quarter of the sites that we visited were occupied, taking that into account with our total sample frame, that indicates that there are now 200 nesting pairs across the state or whatever it might be. So it really gives you two really important kinds of information, what the total population is and what the trend over time might be. And this is described in a paper by Haynes and Pollock, 1998, and again is being suggested for bald eagle surveys across the U.S. But each state can come up with their own sampling scheme, and they really are all over the place right now in terms of how different states are doing it. So I'm just going to go through some of the long-term monitoring programs that have been in place in the United States for a while, some of which you might all be familiar with, and just talk about them with respect to their philosophy, whether or not they account for detection probability, whether the samples sites themselves were selected using a probability-based approach, and then putting the design into the 5 different panel designs that we discussed. And I won't go through these all, but just wanted to point out a few of them. So the top there is a Christmas bird count. Some of you might have even participated in the Christmas bird count. This is, it's really even hard to talk about this as a monitoring system. It was really just started back in the early 1900s as a fun time to go out and count birds with friends around Christmas time. There were some standardizations in terms of how big an area you would sample, and ways of trying to correct for how many people went out by calculating what we call birds per party hour. Basically, however many bird watching groups went out for how many hours would be your denominator, and you divide that into how many birds you saw. But still no real accounting for detection probability. And this has been used to look at changes in distribution of birds over time, looking at northern limits of some wintering populations and so on. So it really has been used in scientific analyses, even though it's a very haphazard kind of sampling. In fact, the locations of the count circles themselves are often very non-randomly chosen. They're often placed so that you get the maximum number of habitats in an area, because the big competition here is how many species you detect on your Christmas bird count. Second is a breeding bird survey. Again, an early warning philosophy. No accounting for detection probability. It's somewhat probability based in that when they chose the locations for those breeding bird surveys, They tried to spread them out across regions in the U.S. and but the problem, the reason I put it as restricted is that all breeding bird surveys are done along secondary roads. So you drive along for a half mile, get out, stand for 3 minutes, count birds, get back in your car, drive, get out. So all the counts are by definition along roads, and that's been a big criticism of the BBS is that you really can't make inferences to off-road areas. The third one there is monitoring avian productivity and survivorship. Again, an early warning philosophy. Detection probability is accounted for because it's a mark recapture approach. No probability-based sampling, and you have to monitor those sites over a number of years to get your survivorship and productivity estimates. Fourth one is the integrated monitoring and bird conservation regions. This is the bird monitoring program designed and carried out by Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. It really has elements of both the early warning and the early control philosophy. It does account for detection probabilities, and the sites that are sampled are probability based, so that allows for inference to large regions. And it's mostly a design one, although depending on questions being asked in specific regions, you may have essentially like a rotating panel type of design where you might look at the effects of oil development in one area, so you specifically set up surveys within the oil development and outside the oil development and sample those over time, and then maybe you'll move on and look at grazing effects and so on. I'm not going to try to go through all the rest of these. Again, some of you might be familiar with them. One thing to notice is on that right-hand column is that almost all of them are design one, where basically just go to the same sites year after year. On the left-hand side, almost all of them are the early warning design. Really only the North American Waterfall Management Plan is the early control type. And there's a real smattering of whether or not detection probability is accounted for. So, lots of different types of survey programs. Obviously, you'd like to see them all probability based, all taking detection probability into account, but in many cases, that's not the case. Here I've just provided some links to websites for different agencies that have set up monitoring systems, and these sites will give you background on those monitoring approaches. Just want to say a little bit about the last one, the BLM Assessment, Inventory, and Monitoring System, AIM. That's just been set up recently. BLM was kind of called to task a few years ago when Congress asked them about information on their resources on their lands, and basically they couldn't provide any information because they had no developed monitoring system. And so as a result of being chastised, they've developed a new system that's going to monitor basically the vegetation across their lands. And of course, there's a lot of grazing on BLM land, so hopefully this will give us insight into grazing impacts on vegetation across a very wide area of the western United States. And finally, I've just given you a list here, a small list of the very voluminous list of studies, papers about monitoring, from sort of philosophical papers like Cawley's to other more critical ones like Nichols. So again, if you're in a position where monitoring is part of your job, might be good to take a look at some of these. There also was a recent book on long-term monitoring that came out about 5 years ago. That would be a good one to take a look at as well.